You then went on to do a PhD, did you? Or?
I went on to do a PhD. So what happened is I did the Paleolithic, and probably at the time the dominant. So you did the Paleolithic with Charles McBurney, who was really quite a figure. I don't know how well you remember him.
I was secretary of the faculty.
He was secretary.
Chaos.
Chaos, absolute chaos. But all the students were very attracted to Eric Higgs because of paleoeconomy and the economics and new methods and so on, and so one saw this kind of dinosauric character of Charles McBurney, and then Eric Higgs, who a bit of a Svengali character who lured people in to his way of thinking and so on. I think I must have a slightly independent streak because I didn't really find either of them attractive. Whereas, so I was with David Clark, and what was unusual was that most of the people who worked with David worked on the Bronze Age or Iron Age, whereas I worked in the Paleolithic. So for me, the unusual thing was I wanted to do a Paleolithic PhD, but I didn't want to have either Higgs or McBurney. And that caused McBurney was upset by that. And I wanted David to be my supervisor. And David, of course, he was quite happy to take on and left me very much to my own devices. And I floundered around, did about 3 PhDs in the first year without ever finding out what it was all about. Very, very useful. I always think it's one of the great tragedies. Nobody can make the mistakes in leisure the way I was able to do, because I learnt a lot from those mistakes. So then. By then I'd got in. I mean, Africa became the big thing, and I wanted to work in Africa. As an undergraduate, I worked in Kenya with Bill Bishop and Glyn Isaac and people who are out there. So I was getting into that whole early man in Africa through archaeology, and I thought that's what I was going to do my PhD on. But to some extent, it was a time when they were just finding these fantastic Australopithecines. It was a bit of a cutthroat environment, and I didn't really like it. And I got very interested in recent African prehistory, the origins of pastoralism. So I started a PhD to do with the late Stone Age and pastoralism, and did quite a lot of it. And with David, but then goes back to theory. I became concerned that the sorts of theories that Eric Higgs was developing about economics didn't make any sense in an African context. And I wanted the theory right. And so I started reading ecology. And that's really, by this time I was sort of realising that science was where I really wanted to be a scientist. I wanted to take a scientific approach. So I started reading a lot of ecology. And then I got in touch with a man called Malcolm Coe in Oxford, who was in the zoology department. I went over because he was a big African ecologist, and I was discovering I was interested in cattle and how they competed with antelopes. I thought that was the answer to pastoralism, not the human but the animal side of it. And Malcolm was terrific, sort of larger than life naturalist, extinct species now. And he said, well, you've obviously got to learn ecology, so why don't you move to Oxford? So I said, I can't move to Oxford. He said, of course you can. And so I moved to Oxford for about 9 months. I stayed in Cambridge as my PhD, but I lived in Oxford and worked in the zoology department in Oxford, where they had an animal ecology group, and went to their seminars and read in their library and talked to Malcolm and other people and basically learnt my ecology. Malcolm Coe, David said, we should make him. He was appointed my supervisor, believe it or not. So I had an Oxford supervisor, and that's when I worked out, the whole thing that became my real thesis by this stage. I spent a lot of time messing around on, animal ecology and the structure of ecological competition, things that they actually formed the building blocks of much of my thinking subsequently. In the end, my thesis, I went off to Africa and started the work in Amboseli. It's a national reserve right down in the south, where it's a game park where there's Maasai and so on. So it was a perfect environment for me to look at the archaeology of pastoralism more or less. So I thought, and of course it had tremendously rich ecological data, so I could do all the modelling on extant data, and that's where I developed the off-site archaeology that was the core of what I did for my thesis, which was to stop thinking in terms of sites. African archaeology, or a lot of tropical archaeology, where you've got these degrading environments, you don't get very much in the way of deep sedimentary sites. You haven't got caves, but what you have is just a rich palimpsest across the landscape of stone tools or pottery. And so what I developed was a way of saying, okay, well, we won't look for sites, I will simply randomly sample landscapes and artifact density. So I produced, of course, days and days and days of drawing contour maps by hand. It will take 30 seconds now. I reckon my thesis now would have taken about 3 months to do it, because
Google Earth.
Well, because it was random. Sorry, this is getting on a slight detour, but it was random sampling across a landscape of 30, 40 square kilometres. And every morning I would use a random number generator to generate coordinates on a map, and then I trot off in my car and find the bits on the landscape I had to sample. But of course I had to do the whole thing through triangulation with a compass. So compasses and maps, and I'd sit there, and I'm pretty good at navigating with a compass. Now with the GPS, the whole morning trying to find where I was supposed to be, and click. And between that and the computer technology that would produce the contour maps that I used to have to draw by hand, my thesis is probably about 10 days' work, I think, if I did it now. But then I did that, and that was to try and bring together the archaeology which clearly had a strong spatial element, with the ecology, which had a spatial element, to try and understand how resources across a landscape and the continuous distributions of human activities across landscapes made sense ecologically. So that's what I set out to do, and spent a year in Africa doing field work, so a very long period in the field. And of course the tragedy of that period, that was when David died.
Was it?
So I was 76. So I'd been in the field three months, something like that.
He was your supervisor?
He was my supervisor. And actually I'd just written him. I was very excited because I just worked out the whole theory of off-site archaeology. For me, I'm not happy with something until I worked it out theoretically, and so I worked out the theory, how to turn in practice. I wrote him a long letter thinking, wow, this is really good. And I've often wondered what he thought of it. I have no idea, because he died. So very, very great, enormous personal tragedy, lovely family and young children, and but I think such a loss to the field. I know you probably know more about it because you were here in Cambridge when he died, whereas I was...
He just handed over the secretaryship of the department, of the faculty to me, and then just died shortly afterwards. I mean, what do you think he would have gone on to do?
I don't know.
He wasn't really a politician in the academic sense.
No, I don't think so. I mean, he loved Cambridge, so I can't see him leaving Cambridge unless the frustration would have got to him. The whole issue, because Glyn Daniel had become professor, then Renfrew, and of course he and Renfrew very similar they're both the great giants of British archaeology, totally different characters, and whether he would have been happy with Colin in the chair, whether I really don't know. Ian Hodder, who was also a student of David's, couldn't have two more different students than Ian and myself. He and I have argued over. He thinks David was beginning to head in the direction of postmodern and so on. I think that's complete rubbish. I think David was always interested in science. I think he would have been very excited by developments in computing, GIS. Those things would have been exciting for him. So I suspect he would have become a leading figure in the more scientific side of archaeology, rather than being part of what then became the great postmodern deconstructionist movement in archaeology that Cambridge became renowned for. But we will never know. But we all want him. I suppose the great the great thing is the tragedy of his death remains, but we will always assume that the future would have been the way we would have wanted it to be.
When you came back and you wrote you finished your PhD, and then what did you do?
So I came back, running out of time and money rapidly, and I started applying for jobs. I applied for JRFs and didn't get any, and then I applied for a number of lectureships. Didn't get any of them until
in archaeology.
And then by sheer chance, somebody said, "Oh, there's a lectureship in Durham, in anthropology in Durham going." It was actually a friend, contemporary of mine called Colin Hazelgrove, who just got a lectureship in archaeology in Durham, and he said, "Oh, they're looking for someone in archaeology to teach human evolution." And I thought, well, have a go at it, because what I had done was worked in the field with Richard Leakey, and I'd been out there on the fossil sites, and probably more than most people in Britain at the time actually knew the emerging field of early man in Africa. So I applied. Much to my enormous surprise, I got called for an interview and they offered me the job. So that was the end of my third year of my PhD. So just when, and I was really getting very, very, thinking about giving up, because when the grant ran out, the money ran out, and that was it. And then I just went straight to Durham with my unfinished PhD and started lecturing in physical anthropology, as then was, and human evolution, which was an eye-opener, I can tell you, because as I said, I had no science background of any significance, other than a Part 1 course from Jim Garlick and Alan Billsborough, and hanging out in a zoology department informally for a year or so. So it was a sharp learning curve to suddenly go into this department which I didn't know well and teach human evolution and fossils and anatomy and so on. So it was
enjoyable.
Very. Very enjoyable, and with hindsight, the best thing that could have happened to me for two reasons, really. One, I think in the end I'm not an archaeologist. And I love being in the field, and I like the evidence of the past, but I'm not an archaeologist in the way that people in the archaeology department are, who really. They like the material and they like the method. For me, that's always a means to an end. I like the ideas, I like the analysis, I like the data, and the sort of pulling together the story of the past by any means. And I don't really care whether it's genetics or it's fossils or it's archaeology. For me, it's the theoretical, it's the problem. And so it was very good for me to get into another environment in which I could do that. And the biological theory, the evolutionary theory that then came into my life, which hadn't been there before, was fantastic. And then the second reason, I just think going to another thing, I think starting a job in a new, you're finishing your PhD, being in a new department where they don't know you, it's a good thing. So it was excellent for that. But so Durham was trying, and Durham is really where I think if you say, well, what have I ever done? It's bringing ecology and evolution together in the way we study humans, and that all happened really in Durham, where it was a strange department. But
who was head of it?
So the head of it was Eric Sunderland,
who
was a sort of grand old man of Durham anthropology. He was a geographer, I think, originally, and wrote.
Was Panterbrick there?
No, this was long before her. So the head of the social anthropologist was Norman Long.
Oh yes, that was an interesting man.
I got on very well with Norman. I shall think about whether. So when I arrived, Eric Sunderland was, of course, an arch university politician. And I think he had manipulated the system so that the lectureship that came up when Norman was away, and made sure it was a physical anthropology post, not a social anthropology post. looking back, it was very odd because I was interviewed in August. So I think I turned up in October to find half the department ready to string me up from the nearest lamppost because Eric had clearly done it behind their backs and got an extra physical job at the expense of the social anthropologists. So I was not very popular, it has to be said, when I arrived, and some people were very forthright about that. And it's funny because Norman was away and everybody said, when Norman gets back he's going to really do you over. so I never met this man, Norman Long, with trepidation. He came back from his sabbatical and his field work, and the phone rang and Norman said, I want you to come down and see me straight away. And he sort of launched in on this, how angry he was. And I said, well, you can blame whoever you like, but the one person you can't blame is me. I just applied for a job and I turned up. And he thought about it and he said, okay, let's go to the pub. And we were terrific friends, and we taught a course together, and Norman and I taught anthropological theory together, which I'm ashamed to say we wrote our lectures in the pub. Before there were 2 o'clock lectures, and we'd meet and think, what the hell are we going to talk about? And we'd go in there and chat for a bit, and then I'd say, okay, Norman, you go in and talk about this, and I'll talk about that.
It's been a great tradition, I'm sure.
It was, but it was not. It's not what would be allowed now. So Durham was fun.
Yeah. How long were you there?
I was there for 9 years, and it changed over that time. The old people gradually disappeared. There were some very old type of anthropologists, but Michael Carithers came, wonderful man.
Yes.
Bob Layton also. I liked enormously. And they're still very good friends from that time. So I enjoyed it. But and then I came back to Cambridge.
And I interviewed you.
And
you won't remember
me. Yes, I do remember. We were in the the council room or the Senate room, there.
Somewhere like that.
Yes. I still, I remember that.
Strange.
Well, you can tell me why they appointed me.
I will off the tape. Why did you want to come back to Cambridge? You just enjoyed it here and you thought it was a bigger stage?
Yes, it was a slightly tough decision because, Durham was beginning to get going. As we know, Durham, I think, is now very successful. Big, successful anthropology department. The new people like, Alan Billsborough, of course, had gone to take over the chair. And Michael Carithers' tremendous energy, and Bob Layton on the social side, and we were. It was beginning, I think, to get on the map. Whereas Cambridge physical anthropology was, I think, probably not in that great shape. So it wasn't it was a bit of a decision. But on the other hand, Cambridge is Cambridge. It was where I'd been a student, and the opportunity was never going to come again. And I thought, I suppose, better in Cambridge was just too big an attraction. Even though I knew the department was small and needed, the potential for growing was going to be difficult. But
and how have you found it? This is to do with the creativity side of things. Obviously, the world has changed immensely. But have you, on the whole, found it
yes,
I think to think in?
Obviously the politics of Cambridge over the last 20 years is not something I feel like talking about. But yes, what have I? If it's the creativity, what has been fantastic for me? I think, to be honest, the biggest thing, of course, was the work I do with Marta.
Yes.
When she got the lectureship in 1999 and came back to Cambridge, and we were able to really build, the human evolution. And what I'd always wanted to do was to make human evolution the centre of biological anthropology. If I can, just a quick detour into the history of biological anthropology. In a sense, everybody knows there was physical anthropology before the war, and evolutionary anthropology, as it died with Haddon and Seligman and all these people, both of whom are great heroes of mine. But anyway, physical anthropology went through a very bad time before the wars, and the only conceptual framework was race and racial variation. The fossil stories were pretty bizarre. and then after the war, the new generation, the Geoffrey Harrisons and Gabriel Lasker and people like that, said, okay, let's drop all the evolution. Let's get rid of the evolutionary history. Let's focus instead on adaptability, humans and the environment, get rid of the genes and so on. So what grew up then was this strongly non-evolutionary, not very theoretical, very environmental, nurturist view of human biology, human adaptability, human variation, 1,000 growth curves all showing how variable. And, tremendously important work, but a long, long way from any coherent view on the human species. Very practical, very, I think, a bit stamp collecting in its whole approach. So that was, and that was people like Jim Garlick. That Oxford was the great place for all that work. And so the evolution side of it was at the time, human evolution was half a paper, and that was it. And one wanted to. So I always for me, evolution and ecology is the core of anthropology. You think about why humans are the way they are. They are because they've evolved. They've evolved through natural selection. Natural selection is about the costs, the benefits of doing things in particular environments, and that to me is what we do. And I don't really mind whether it's Australopithecines or monkeys or pygmies in the Central African rainforests. It's how we study human variation in an ecological environment. So that was always what we wanted to do, and it took a long time for that to grow. So creatively working with Marta in the 90s, and when she came back, and that was when, of course, the origins of modern humans. Suddenly we had a better understanding of how human diversity and human evolution went together. That was the big revolution in the 80s, which I don't think anybody really realised. Everyone thought, it's all about genes, it's out mitochondria out of Africa. Actually about linking together human diversity and human evolution in a coherent framework, and that's what we worked on. So the creativity came from that, and that was very much within the department, within the field. I mean, the other side of Cambridge for creativity was this is where the college actually counts, because it was the anthropologists and the biologists in King's, and I always remember discussions with Ernest Gellner. Ernest, never a man of great small talk. Nope. So
he would stand there looking at you,
hopefully, and you have to say something, serious and intellectual, or you felt you did. I don't know whether I'd said, did you watch the football last night? He would have said yes. I don't know, but he always got the feeling he wanted some deep intellectual conversation. So for me, that sort of environment came out of social anthropology. The other person, believe it or not, was Keith Hart. Was also interested in trying to build. So that provided some sort of framework. But then the zoologists, so in King's, Pat Bateson, Barry Cavern, Mike Bate, and all these people, and Charlie Loeb, all discussing things that were interesting. So for me, the creativity has come very much from that. Those interactions, and then to some extent, but rather less with the archaeologists, and Paul Mellors has always been around. But archaeology, funnily enough, didn't really, by then it was so social and postmodernist, and it didn't really have that much in those days in common with what they were doing.
What about teaching? I mean, some people find teaching takes them away from what they want to do, and others say that the supervision system and lecturing feeds very well into their creative work. You have a huge load in bioants.
We do. I don't have as big a load as many people, but I think probably to answer that I need to go back to Durham, because the simple answer is I find teaching has been an enormously important source of ideas for me, and Durham, because nobody could agree about a syllabus. As you can imagine, big general anthropology department, and nobody really agreed about anything. So everyone got on with what they wanted to do, which I think a very, I'm sure sure it's changed now. It was a very fruitful period for me. So I was just given a year's course to teach human evolution. They said, what's it going to be called? I said, well, I'll call it Human Evolution and Ecology. And I had to go and give 2 lectures a week or something on human evolution and ecology, and I made it up as I went along. So for me, and the book I wrote in the 80s, Another Unique Species, it is basically the things I thought about while teaching that course. So for me, teaching has always been a stimulus, because I like to feed what's going on outside humans, outside anthropology, into my understanding of humans. And that means reading widely, that means teaching and pulling it together. I've never been very good at lecturing on from other people's textbooks. I mean, I can't do it. I mean, I just don't. So I always I need to say, okay, what is the overarching theory that makes this course make sense, or this lecture? It needs to have a coherent story. And a lecture, an hour's lecture or a lecture course, provides a wonderful vehicle for that. And so teaching is important. We've completely revised the tripos here, the biological anthropology tripos, and very much we wanted, in restructuring it, to allow people to have 12 lectures to just say, this is what I really want to put together as a coherent view on this aspect of human evolution or this aspect of human biology. And that for me is important. Supervision's, I enjoy the personal contact, and I enjoy first year teaching, when you can really sort of get them thinking, but probably the challenge of having to raise one's game to lecture is good, as long as you don't do too much of it. If it gets too much, then it starts to be counterproductive.
What about PhD supervisions? Did you do a lot of that?
I've done a lot. I mean, I must have supervised 20 or 25 PhD students over the years. Well, it's the usual, some of it's blissfully wonderful, and some of it is a grind. Is a challenge and a grind. It depends a lot on the students. But some of my, I've still got hopefully good friends amongst the PhD students I have supervised, and yes, it is a stimulating activity. I think it's changed. I think that the last 10 or 15 years has seen the PhD become less of an intellectual adventure and more of a ticket. And that obviously is less, satisfactory. And the whole pressures of who's going to co-author papers at the end, and is it your project, is it their project? The pressure one puts on them to complete on time, because we get punished if not. All these things have changed the ability to just follow one's nose scientifically or intellectually, and that's a shame. That's true undergraduates too. I mean, the idea of making up courses as you went along, which I think was very successful, because when say Norman Long and I were saying, okay, how can we teach a joint course on anthropological theory with such different perspectives? If we had to sit down, learning outcomes and objectives, we'd never have got there. But he would talk and I would talk, and it turned out, which I had never realised, Norman was a transactionalist. He was a student of Max Gluckman, and that whole approach is very individual based. And so actually Norman and I had a lot more in common with each other, because in evolutionary theory the focus is on the individual and the individual relationship. So things emerge from the perspective of the individual and the interactions between individuals, which is exactly the same as the Manchester School of Social Anthropology. So Norman and I, although we disagreed about many things and about the role of biology and evolution, actually shared a similar framework. Well, I think without the informality of the teaching we did, we would never have. I learned a lot, and I think I'd like to think he learned a lot from that interaction.
I often ask people to, and this is sometimes difficult, but if you were explaining to someone what you thought your 2 or 3 main contributions in your discipline had been, what you will be remembered for, what the chapter will break down into on your life and work in future years, what would you think were they?
Very difficult. I mean, I think I think things get forgotten much faster now than they used to, because there's so many people, working in the same field. I mean, the days when an Evans Pritchard or someone could dominate the entire field, because there were only probably 10 people around, have gone. But so I think the things I've done that I mean, there are, as well, empirical based things, and I still would like to think that what I did in off-site archaeology with my PhD, which is still a lot of it's now moved on. It's called landscape archaeology, and many techniques have changed. It's much more sophisticated. But basically, the idea of thinking about the archaeological record as a continuously distributed set of activities, or human activities continuously distributed across the landscape, is one I think that shapes a lot of things today. And I wasn't the only person around doing that, but I think what I did was part of that. But for me, I suppose I've already said this. To me, it's the bringing of an ecological perspective to human evolution. If you think human evolution, certainly in this country, was dominated by professors of anatomy. And not surprising, the fossils told the story. So it was strongly anatomical. It varied. Sometimes it was phylogenetic evolutionary relationships. Sometimes it was strongly functional. But basically, it was an anatomical subject, which also meant that the big story of human evolution was about changes in anatomy. And of course, you and I know that while our anatomy is fascinating, it's not really what makes us a special species. And so, for me, you've got to find a way of tackling the behaviour, the culture, the cognition. Well, lots of people can do that, but what for my mind is that none of those things can take place except against an ecological background. So the ecology, the environment, the way you get your energy shapes it. So very simply, I mean, the people know perfectly well a brain is a very metabolically expensive organ. So you can't have a large brain unless you've got the right diet, unless the resources are there. So, the growing large brains is not, which might give you culture, it might give you religion, whatever, but it can only happen against a particular ecological background. So the thrust of everything I've done is to link evolution and ecology together in all sorts of different ways, different scales, different problems, but that's it. And I suppose that in doing that, it's brought behaviour in. Right? And I suppose the other thing is unlike, I've always, again, it goes back to theory. I've always liked problems to have a theoretical starting point and a theoretical framework. And so I think a lot of what I've done, and I think this probably does make it ephemeral and will not have the impact that one would like, is because for me, I'm very interested in applying general principles of evolutionary theory to humans and saying, okay, look, these things work. So the models of evolution and environment, or evolution and climate, or the phylogenetics of behaviour, those are all theoretical proposals. But theory in my field doesn't last, or at least it doesn't have the impact, but I like it.
And I mean, institutionally, one of your obvious achievements is setting up the new Hume Centre. You want to just say a word about that?
I mean, that's well, I mean, the first thing I say is, I was the co-founder of it. I mean, that came
with Martha.
With Martha, yes. I mean, that came from when she came in '99, and we thought, we really wanted to try and build something in Cambridge, and there were opportunities for bids in, and we just went to the university and said, could we have a centre for human evolutionary studies? And they said, well, if you get the money. So for us, it was a way of trying to make human evolution a kind of secure part of Cambridge academic life. And it was a sort of, if Martha and I had gone under a bus in 2000, there was nothing in a way, the subject could have gone in any number of directions. And we wanted to say, well, human evolution is really important, and it's important for all sorts of reasons. I mean, you probably don't agree. I'm in an archaeology and anthropology faculty, and that sometimes the zealousness of evolutionary biologists can grate, but I do think evolution is tremendously important for understanding humans, not just the anatomy, it's the behavior and social organization. And then we're not talking sort of old-fashioned sociobiology, we're talking about a whole range of different approaches. We know that, say, I mean, the genomics is transforming the way we can look at human diversity. We're understanding about the relationships of, or beginning to, phenotypes and genotypes and how they vary, and epigenetics. Well, we kind of saw that all coming in 2000, and we thought we wanted a place where these things can be done together. We're not, it's not that there are geneticists out there thinking this and fossil people thinking that and primates and so on. We want to say, let's all be in a single institution devoted to integrating different approaches, because in the end we want a single story. So Marta and I especially always had more energy and drive than I did about this. She said, let's go out. And we put the plans together and we raised the money from the Wellcome Trust for the building, from the Levium Trust for the extra posts, because it was Marta and I and our technician and Maggie Belatti and a couple of PhD students were the basis of LCHES, and now now I think there are 40 people working in the building. So it is an attempt to institutionalize an idea.
Organising 40 people, along with being head of department and director of studies at King's. I mean, how do you manage to do all these things?
And, it becomes harder and harder. I think the answer is sheer exhaustion.
Exactly.
It's Oscar Wilde, isn't it? Who is it who said, there's only one thing worse than not having your dreams come true? And that's having your dreams come true. So it has been an enormous. And I think Marta and I both feel that we've taken on an enormous challenge. Some of it's been very pleasurable, some of it's been very difficult and painful, because, as you say, what we wanted to do was to have the time to be able to go into the field, to study, to talk, to write the books and so on. And you end up, having to raise grants and manage people, and that's not what we want to do. So I think it's been a sobering lesson as well as to what's happening. And of course, what we didn't know, it would happen. What we were trying to do would happen in an environment in which the university has changed very markedly. So for us, it was always going to be a kind of free and easy institution in which you didn't worry too much about student numbers or this, that, and the other. And when the university started to centralise everything into schools and having school strategies, and enormous pressure on things, it meant that we were trying to create a new institution in the university at a time when suddenly institutions were being managed and controlled, and I personally happen to find that whole shift is a it will in the end damage the creativity of the university, because we are seeing the kind of micromanagement of systems and the free-for-all of ideas, which is actually what we should be doing. I mean, I'm not saying we don't pay the bills, but I think the bills will be paid by giving people the freedom to pursue what they want to do without managing, without asking for reports all the time. That's been... You asked about teaching and research. I would teach happily many hours. What I'm fed up with is the kind of growth of administration in order to either teach or do research, and that will always cramp new initiatives in the university or any university.
Just two more questions.
Yes, I wouldn't want to end on a negative note like that, but I did.
Let's end on a more positive one. To do with personal creativity, I mean, I always ask people where they get, which part of their lives generate, interesting new ideas. Is it in the bath? Is it in the pub? Is it on a walk? Or how they work? Something about working methods. So, where do you find inspiration?
Often little things I observe or hear will stimulate things, and again, so for a lot, again, it goes back to thinking theoretically. For me, I hear something, I think, what is how do I generalize that? What becomes, the general proposition, which then I can think into a fuller framework. So you might, hear somebody say, could even be on the radio, somebody will say something about, why people are conformist or not conformist. You suddenly think, well, okay, what are the costs and benefits of being a conformist? How does that play out? What is it frequency dependent? And things go on from that. So it's stimulated. Often with me, it's little things which will get. Undoubtedly, it's talking and listening to people. Going to lectures, and somebody will say something, a little fact, a little thing. God, I didn't know that. Wow, and it links up to something else. So again, I hate to say it goes back to David Clarke and Geoffrey Vauxhall. It's seeing links between things that are apparently unconnected. So anything that does that, for me, again, I've worked now with Martha for 20 years nearly, and that is an endless stimulation, and it's stimulating partly because she knows so much and she reads so widely, but also she never lets go of something and say, well, why do you think that? That doesn't make sense. And I think, oh God, no, it doesn't. So we have a tremendously good, intellectual relationship in that way, and then I do find teaching. Often, students can ask wretched questions, which you think, better go and find out what the answer to that is. So, but I'm afraid to say I'm deeply unsystematic, and I'm not good at. I think, unlike really good scientists, I don't follow things through to the end to be absolutely certain. I think it's just something that once I kind of have it in my head as a theoretical framework, satisfied myself, and that's a weakness. But for me, it's things will spark ideas, and it's always looking for the unexpected connections between things. It's that's exciting.
Well, that's a very nice positive note to end on. But was there anything that you'd have liked me to have asked you about?
Oh, well, that's a question I always ask at the end of undergraduate admissions. I know no one's ever asked me that before. I don't think so. I don't think there's anything that I particularly would have wanted to talk about. That I did. I mean, we've covered an awful lot of ground. Some things I didn't even remember. But no, I think it's been fun.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Rob.
Yeah. Okay, well, I've enjoyed it, and I shall have to reflect on what I've reflected.